Acts chapter 7. In Acts chapter 7, it's one of those that we're not going to read the whole thing tonight because it's fairly lengthy and there's a lot to say. But it's one of those that if you just read Acts chapter 7, if you took it out of context and someone just said, just read just this chapter, it kind of just reads like, although it's very thorough, just a massively condensed, fact-filled retelling of Israel's history. And because of that, many people would probably find it to be somewhat boring because it seems as if Stephen's not making a bunch of sort of deep theological points, that he's just saying this is what happened, basically from the beginning up until now in the life of God's people, and this is the way that God has worked. But what we're going to find out is actually that this is really one of the most amazing kind of powerful passages in all of Scripture. And so I want to do two things tonight. I want to just work our way through it and see why Stephen said what he's saying. So Stephen's point in saying this, and his point to the point he's making to the Jewish leaders that have brought him in because of his witnessing for Christ. And then at the end, make some more devotional points, maybe not exactly what Stephen is saying here, but things that are true from what Stephen is saying. So that's what we're going to do. But before we get into Acts chapter 7, there's one thing I wanted to mention. Acts chapter 7 is one of those chapters that critics of the Bible and people that say that the Bible is not trustworthy because there are errors in it. Acts chapter 7 is one of those places where people will point. And there's six major sort of, I don't call them errors, I would say they're discrepancies. So 6 statements that Stephen makes that if you look elsewhere in Scripture, the numbers or the times or the dates or the places don't exactly line up. And so if you're interested in those things, I've got some, I just ran off a few because I doubt probably very many people are interested, but I've got some papers here that first of all address those things, that they tell you what they are, and then they walk through them. So the first thing I wanted to say is most of the discrepancies can be explained very logically. But the main thing I think is important for us in just being good Bible students is understanding that in Jesus' day and prior to that, they didn't think like we thought. And so, this is an oral, where they're passing things on in an oral tradition. And so in telling stories, getting every small detail was not what was important. It was to get the main point of the story. And so that's why in the Gospels you see the differences in detail sometimes, and people will point to the Gospels and say, well, they can't be trusted because they don't agree. So like in Luke and Mark, and you remember the story of the casting out of the demons or the healing of the demoniac, the guy that's chained up and he's out in the Gerasenes, and Jesus goes to him and cast out the demons into the pigs. In Luke and Mark, there's one demoniac. Matthew tells the same story. There's 2 demoniacs. And so people will say, well, look, it's different. Well, the point of that was not how many demoniacs were there. Right? And the explanation would be probably that Matthew's gospel is very orderly. He's a tax collector. He's accountant-minded, money and order and all those kind of things, and that's reflected all throughout his gospel. So there are 2 demoniacs there. Only one of them spoke. So the other 2 just mention the one that spoke, and Matthew mentions both of them because he's trying to get details. But the point of that is that no one hearing that story in Jesus' day would refute that and say, well, that's not true because these facts don't line up. They weren't, to use a current term, they weren't fact-checking these things. So to be good Bible students, we need to understand that sometimes the main point is really what matters, and checking out every little detail is not the issue. And that's certainly going on here in Acts chapter 7. Stephen's points are really what is important, or the main point of what God is doing in the life of his people is what Stephen is stressing. So we're going to get to Acts chapter 7, but let's get back just a little bit. Acts chapter 6, because in order to understand what Stephen is doing here, we need to understand why he's doing it. So if you'll remember from last week, Stephen has been called in front of the council because accusations have been brought against him. And so let's start there, Acts chapter 6, beginning in verse 11. We'll just go 11 through 15. It says, then they secretly instigated men who said, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God. And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council. And they set up false witnesses who said, this man never ceases to speak words against this holy place, the temple, and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us. And gazing at him, all who sat in the council saw that his face was like the face of an angel. So there's three kind of big things here. They repeat them. There's blasphemy against God and Moses, but I want to focus especially on Moses. So blasphemy against the most important, well, I guess you could say maybe David, but in Israel's life, the most important figure, outside of God, of course, the most important person in the history of Israel. Then you've got the temple, so the accusation that Stephen is blaspheming or speaking ill of the most important place in the life of Israel. And then the law, this sort of accusation that Jesus is coming and going to change the law, change the customs. So the foundational piece of Israel, the law is not what makes them God's people, but the law is what defines who God's people are. And so because of that, Jesus is therefore being rejected. And it's important that we understand those accusations, because that's exactly what Stephen is going to address here in Acts chapter 7. So let's look at verse 1 and make a few comments, and then we'll move on. It begins, the high priest said, are these things so? Well, the accusations, are they true, Stephen? And Stephen said, brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. So I want to just point out a few things here. First of all, the high priest. The high priest is, as far as we know, still Caiaphas. So unless Caiaphas has had a radical change of heart from when he condemned Jesus to death, Stephen probably knows exactly how this is going. All right, because what would have to happen here is Caiaphas would have to admit that he was wrong about killing Jesus. And that's probably not going to happen, even if he thought it, because that would just be somewhat of, not political suicide, but kind of that, I mean, that would really damage his reputation as the high priest, even if he thought it, to admit that what he had done, that he had killed an innocent man. So Stephen probably can see the writing on the wall, especially if this is Caiaphas. The other thing I want to point out there in verse 2 is Stephen, that first line there where Stephen begins, brothers and fathers, hear me. That's called an exordium, and that was a normal part of a defense, which is, again, what Stephen is doing here. He's defending, making a defense of himself against these accusations. And so an exordium usually is a chance for the person that's giving a defense to sort of butter up his audience, to, say, oh, men of Jerusalem, wonderful, and all those kind of flowery things, in hopes that, it's going to win some favor with those people. Obviously, I don't read these things, but from what I understand, the people that do research ancient text, that this is the most, along with others, it's not the most, but along with a couple others, is the most curt exordium that we have recorded. And it's 5 Greek words. In Greek, it actually says men, brothers, and fathers and brothers, listen, right? So that's what Stephen says. So the whole thing about men, holy men, and all this, you're skipping all that. He just says, listen. And the point, I think, is that Stephen is not here to try and really even win an argument. He's not here to defend himself. He's here to say the truth. And whatever God does with that truth, Stephen trusts God for that. I'm not even sure Stephen is really trying to convert anyone here. I do think that Stephen has passionate about Jesus, but Stephen is, here's the truth. Whatever God does in your heart, then let that be. And so that's exactly the way Stephen handles this defense that he gives of himself. So thinking about those accusations, we said the first thing that they brought accusation against Stephen was his blaspheming Moses. And so Stephen, in this defense, focuses primarily on 3 very large figures in Israel's history. There's others, but the 3 main ones are Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. So let's think about this, and I'm going to throw this out there to you. So this is actually a question for you to answer. What connections are there between Abraham and Jesus? In Abraham's story and Jesus' story, what connections do we have? What? Okay. 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 Covenant wise, what do we got covenant wise? The first. Right, and they'd be the blessing to the nation. So we've got the covenant. So we got the covenant, the promise, that Abraham's family would be the blessing, and Abraham receives that first covenant, and Jesus is the giver of the second covenant, right? Think about Abraham's story. What do we got that reminds us of Jesus? Isaac, Abraham and Isaac, right? Another father-son story where they go up a hill and the son is going to be sacrificed. Of course, in the Abraham and Isaac story, Isaac is not sacrificed because God provides the ram. And so then you've got the ram-lamb connection. Also in that story, it's Isaac that's got the wood for the sacrifice. Isaac carries it. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus carrying the wood for his sacrifice, the cross. So we've got real connections there, right? What connections do we have between Joseph and Jesus? Okay, so Joseph is one of the 12, and the 12 sons, and Jesus has 12 disciples. Good. What happens to, where does Joseph end up very early in the story? Sold into slavery, right? He ends up in a pit. His brothers reject him. He gets thrown into a pit. But then what happens to Joseph over the course of this story? He's exalted, right? He gets put to the second highest position, which is not exactly what I would say about Jesus, but Joseph ends up at the right hand of the Egyptian leader. Jesus ends up at the right hand of God. They both start out of a pit. They both get exalted. They both end up in Egypt. They're both sold for silver. A lot of connections between Joseph and Jesus. What connections do we have between Moses and Jesus? Any? Yeah, feel free to. Huh? Okay, so Jesus gets the. Oh yeah, I mean Moses receives the law. Jesus fulfills the law. Oh, the number of 40. Yes, that's significant in both of their lives. Very good. How were the people saved, or what time? What's going on when the people are saved in Moses is before the Exodus and Jesus? What's going on? What's the festival? Passover, so we got the Passover connection. We've got the blood of the Lamb connection. We've got, I think you could even say the crossing of the Red River. I mean, not the Red River. That's football, too much football. The crossing of the Red Sea, in which God splits the Red Sea with Moses, with Jesus. He provides the Red Sea, the blood of the Lamb, that would be covered in that. Obviously leading people out of slavery into freedom. All kinds of connections. And so what Stephen is doing here is he's not just reciting history. He's making a point. And his point to these men is, look, here's these guys that you hold to the highest in the highest esteem, and every one of them is prefiguring Jesus. That everything that God has began in these guys is just to show us what God is going to do in Messiah, who is this man Jesus that you all have chosen to crucify. And so that's why I'm proclaiming him, because he's the fulfillment of everything that God has begun doing. So again, he's not just reciting history, he's making a point, and he's saying that all these important figures prefigure Jesus. All these important men prefigure Jesus. But he does it in a very specific way, or a very specific thing about them. So let's look at Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 8. There's a theme that runs through Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. 2 through 8 says this. And Stephen said, "Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Go out from your land and from your kindred and go to the land that I will show you.' Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. Yet he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, though he had no child. And God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. But I will judge the nation that they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. And he gave them the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. And so there's a lot of things that Stephen could have said about Abraham, but he kind of focuses on some of these things that seem not so positive. There's the promise there, but he says, but God didn't give him, he didn't have a foot's length in the land. He had no inheritance. He had to leave his home. He had to leave his family. His descendants are going to be enslaved. And also, this is important. The Bible doesn't say this, but these Jewish leaders would have understood this. Abraham's father, who he mentions here, the rabbinic tradition is that Abraham's father is an idolater. And so Abraham is having to completely separate himself. Now, again, that's not scripture, but what I'm saying is that would have been held to be true, a true belief from these people that are accusing Stephen. So what he's saying is Abraham had to do this. He had to be separated from family. He had to be separated from his home. All these things. And so Stephen is certainly not saying that God rejected Abraham, because we all know that to not be true, and as Stephen's audience would have known that not to be true. But the point that Stephen's making is, in his time, he was promised a bunch of land and promised a bunch of kids, and he dies basically with neither one of those things. It seemed as if God was rejecting him. And the exact same thing could be said for Jesus. It seemed as if God was rejecting him, and especially, of course, that ultimate moment on the cross, that seemed like just a complete rejection from the Father. That everyone mocking him would have seen it as that. And then Jesus saying on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" would have certainly led the people there at the foot of the cross, at least for a time, to have thought that the Father was rejecting the Son. And so there's this theme of rejection. We know that that's not what happened, but it seemed like it. And I think that's Stephen's point. You all are rejecting Jesus. It seemed as if God rejected Jesus. Or it seemed as if God rejected Moses or Abraham, and now he's done the same in Jesus. Let's go on to Joseph. In verse 9, the very first verse when he talks about Joseph. The patriarchs, they were jealous of Joseph, so they sold him into Egypt, but God was with him. So again, the very first thing he leads with Joseph is this theme of rejection, that his brothers rejected him. He doesn't mention this, but then eventually Joseph gets put into Potiphar's house, and we know what happens there. He's rejected there and imprisoned there. And so Joseph's life is sort of a life of rejection until God finally, at the end, exalts him. And then go into Moses' life. Verse 20, beginning of verse 20, says this: "At this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed," right? Moses was, in one sense, rejected as a baby. When he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Then 23 through 27. "But when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He is supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are my brothers. Why do you wrong each other? But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of his 2 sons. So we got the first 40 years of Moses' life begin with rejection. The second set of 40 years of Moses' life begin with rejection by his people after killing this Egyptian man. And then we go on, verse 35 says this Moses, whom you rejected, saying, Who made you a ruler and judge? This man God sent is both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea, in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will rise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, he received living oracles to give to us. Our fathers refused to obey him, but they thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt. So the first set of 40 years begins with rejection. The second set of 40 years in Moses' life begins with rejection. And the third set of 40 years where he's actually leading the people, he is again rejected by God's people. Who made you ruler, right? So there's a theme in all three of these men's life of rejection. And you think about all the stuff that we just said, how deep theologically Stephen could have gotten about how these 3 men are connected to Jesus. I mean, that's the story we would tell probably, right? I mean, if I was telling about Moses and Jesus, I would definitely want to think about Passover and Exodus and the lamb's blood and all those things. And he doesn't mention those things. Instead, what he mentions is rejection, that all these men were rejected. Well, let's see why. We go to the end of Stephen's speech in verse 51. You stiff-necked people. Uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law is delivered by angels and did not keep it. So he's pointing out to them that there's a series of God's men, that's really the history of God's men, has been rejection by the people of Israel. And the fact that you men, you leaders now of Jerusalem, stand here and reject Jesus doesn't actually mean he's not Messiah. Actually, what God is showing us is that Jesus has fallen right in line in the pattern of what God does amongst his people. Your rejection of Jesus actually proves that he is God's man, that he is the fulfillment of all these things. And so if you look at chapter 7, it just looks like he's just telling Israel's story. But in fact, he's pointing out these deep truths that all these men were pointing to Jesus, but especially the rejection that you now offer to Jesus has always been the thing that God's people have done towards the ones that God had called them to lead him. And you are in your rejection proving that he is Messiah, and God is continuing his work in Jesus. And so, again, I think that might be lost on us 2,000 years later. But I don't think in any way, especially based on the fact or how Stephen concludes this defense, that's the point. Stephen is making a point here about Jesus. And so we've got the issue with Moses that they brought against Stephen. They also accused him of blaspheming against the temple. And so he addresses that as well. Let's look at verse 44 through 50. It says this. Our fathers had the tent of witness in the wilderness, the tabernacle, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it, according to the pattern that he had seen. Our fathers in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. So it was until the days of David, who found favor in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet said. Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things happen? So Stephen starts out talking not about the temple, but the tabernacle. And I can't think of a better word, really, but I just think about the word portal. But the tabernacle is sort of the portal through which Israel encounters Yahweh. And that's the way that God intended it to be. And Stephen speaks very sort of flatteringly of the tabernacle. You'd almost think that he likes the tabernacle better than the temple. I don't think that's really the point. But Stephen here clearly cares about the tabernacle. It was constructed with care. That's one of the points he makes. It's the place of community in Israel, or was. It's obviously the central place of worship in the community of Israel. It's the place that God's presence was clearly seen through the pillar of cloud. God is obviously the power that enabled the people to go into the promised land and dispossess the people there. But if you look at verse 45, he says, our fathers in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. And so he's giving credit. Obviously, the credit goes to God, but it's God uses the tabernacle, right? Because that's where God is. And so it's this place that brought them into the promised land. And so I don't think that he's saying the temple or the tabernacle is better, but when he starts to talk about the temple, what's he point out? That David wanted to build it, but he couldn't. And we know why, because of his bloody warfare. God would not allow David to build the temple. And so even though this temple is obviously, it is a place that matters to God, very much so. We see that in Jesus' life. It starts off sort of on the wrong foot, that the guy that wants to build it isn't allowed to build it because of his own unholiness, so to speak. And then Stephen references it as being a place that was built by hands, houses made by hands. And that's, of course, a statement of fact that the temple is a place built by hands. The tabernacle is as well. But Stephen refers specifically of the temple as a house built by hands, because that phrase, house built by hands, that's a phrase that is connected to idolatry. And so clearly by the time that Jesus arrived at the temple, that's Jesus' problem with what the people have made the temple, right? A den of thieves and robbers. They've made it a place of idolatry. And so Jesus condemns it. And Jesus cleans it and clears it. But then he says, tear it down and I'll rebuild it again. He prophesies that it's going to be torn down. So again, Stephen isn't condemning the temple, but it certainly has its problems. But I think his biggest critique of the temple and the tabernacle is not that the temple had its problems, but that it is a house made by hands and that it can't contain God. And that's why he quotes Isaiah. Let's look at that again, verse 49. Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all of these things? Stephen's bigger point is that if the temple is removed, because God can't be contained in a house, right? God can't be contained in something that was made by hands. So if the temple is removed, as Jesus was claiming it would be, he prophesied it would be, God's presence would still remain with his elect. That God's presence is not with his people because there is a building. Stone and gold and all those things don't equate to God's presence. That God's presence will be there. Now here's the other thing that this is saying. Not just that God's presence will be there, but if God is not contained in the temple, that if God will still be, but he can be outside the temple, Jewish leaders, that means he doesn't have to hang out in Jerusalem. That means that in just a very short while, he's actually going to go outside of Israel. And another thing that Stephen points out here is you go through the text, which we haven't really seen too much of in what we read, almost everywhere Stephen mentions in this defense of his is outside of Israel. And he's making this point that God has done his greatest works outside of the land. That God's brought redemption and done all these things, brought salvation to his people outside of the land. And what Stephen is, I think, foreshadowing or telling what's going to happen here, Look at the very next thing that happens. Look at Acts chapter 8, verse 1. It says Saul approved, it's not on the screen, but Saul approved of Stephen's execution. Stephen does die, spoiler alert. Saul approved of his execution, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, which we looked at that last week. Verse 4, now those who scattered went about preaching the word. So immediately after Stephen is killed, God takes the gospel and takes it to the Gentiles. And that's what Stephen is saying here. He's saying all these men are Jesus, that they all point to Jesus. They point to him specifically by rejection, and your rejection is just further proof that Jesus is the Messiah. And what God is doing here, it's not a bad thing, but God is fixing to show his love and his mercy and grace to people that it once did not belong to. That he is expanding his people, is expanding his family. And to me, I thought one of the coolest things about going to Israel, and I mean, if you ever get the chance to go, I'd certainly say go, because you really start to see the Bible in color and you see all these wonderful places. But I thought one of the best experiences was just simply landing there in, where do you land? Tel Aviv, and then you go to Joppa. I don't know if you all did because you got your stuff messed up. But you go to Simon the tanner's house and all that, and Brent gives this awesome speech about it being a homecoming, and it's cool because I don't think we have any Jews in here. I'm not, but it is a homecoming for me as a Gentile. That the land is our land, so to speak, as well, because God opens up that to us in his love and mercy, and just didn't keep it for the Jewish people, but it's available to all people. And it's a wonderful thing to think about. And so that's what Stephen is doing. Again, he's not just recounting history, but he's pointing to Jesus. And I would say that just to kind of finish with what Stephen is doing, I think you could take Stephen's speech here and it would fit very nicely in the book of Hebrews. That Stephen's kind of point is, here's all these things that God has done, and Jesus is the better of all those things. He's the better high priest. He's the fulfillment of the law. All the things of the Old Testament, as wonderful as they are, Jesus is the fulfillment or the better way or version of them. And that's what Stephen is doing. He's sharing the gospel. He's not defending himself exactly, but he's sharing the gospel. So, we'll do questions in a minute, but that's what I wanted to think about just through the text. A few thoughts that I had. We have a little bit of time. Just kind of devotional thoughts that I had that might encourage us as we look through this list of men. Every one of them are called. And we're all called. Every Christian is called. I think we looked at that text either in Sunday school or sermon. Live a life worthy of your calling. Every one of us is called. But what stands out to me about these men here that Stephen lists, and you could include David in that rejection theme. Every one of these men is called. They're called in the desert. They're called in not the place that you might expect. And so, I think a lot of us would love to have a burning bush kind of moment. I mean, it would be great to hear straight from God and to be told to take off your sandals. You're standing in holy ground. It'd be great to have that experience, but sometimes God has to lead you into the worst of places. I didn't have to, but he will lead you into the worst of places to hear his voice. And so there's hope, I think, sometimes if we're in those seasons of life that just seem like, what's going on here, God? Sometimes that's the place where you're going to hear God's voice most clearly. Sometimes he has to get you out of the good to get you to pay attention. And so there's that he calls us and he's faithful to that call, but sometimes he's going to take us out into a place we don't want to be so that we can hear that calling. And the second thing, sort of, I guess, similar to that or along those lines, is that faith is the basis of our relationship with God. And when I say faith, I don't simply mean an intellectual assent to something, that Jesus is Lord or that Jesus is God's Son, but I'm talking about actual trust. So obedience, trusting God, and a big part of that is just to understand that God is the one who makes the rules, or God is the one who leads, and we're the ones who obey and follow, no matter what that means. And I think you go to the very first person Stephen mentions here, and it's Abraham. And he's the person that receives the first covenant. And then Stephen mentions that the sign of that covenant is circumcision. And, we can't talk about circumcision too much because we're always with kids, it seems like. So we can make a few comments here. But, and I don't mean any of this to be funny, but like, if you just had that encounter with God, I think this is awesome. But now, Abraham, you got to go circumcise yourself. That's going to be the sign. I don't know. My first thought might be, how many kids or how much land does a guy actually need? You know what I mean? And when I read Galatians, and the real issue there is circumcision, it's easy, again, 2,000 years down the road to think, yeah, these guys are goofy because they're adding the law to Jesus. Just accept Jesus. And circumcision was the issue of the law that is being dealt with in Galatia. On some level, I have a lot of respect for them because that was their level of commitment to Jesus. I mean, for us, it's pretty easy to come and be like, yeah, I believe in Jesus. This is going to require something, and it's going to require circumcision. To me, these people weren't messing around. They were serious. And I would think, like, if God told me, you're blessing upon you, and you're my chosen person, now circumcise yourself, that would be odd. They'd be like, why are you doing that, God? But what do we know about circumcision? Well, we know now that it's the healthiest thing for men, but it's especially the healthiest thing for women. And there's actually a hospital in New York that ministers to women, and they were one of the first people that found out that Jewish women get cervical cancer at a far less or fewer, whatever the word is, rate than non-Jewish women because of circumcision. And they're not, we don't have to get into the details of it. You know why. So that very odd thing that God was doing, he was loving and protecting his people. And he was making it possible in some ways that building this great nation through procreation was going to be safe and healthy for his people. The other cool thing about this is, if you want to think about, I mentioned that Acts chapter 7, people will point to those discrepancies and say the Bible can't be trusted. Here's the thing you could point to in Acts chapter 7 and say, ooh, God really knows what he's doing. The eighth day, the circumcision of the children is the eighth day. There's two, I guess the word is chemicals, I don't know if that's right, two chemicals in your body, at least, that stop blood clotting. One's vitamin K, and one is called prothrombin. And the levels of both those chemicals when you're born drastically reduce in your body. And then on the eighth day, or right about there, they increase to 110% of what your normal level. And it never goes that high again in your life. So, did Abraham know that? Did he have any sense of that? No. But that's just an awesome thing to think about. Here's God doing this perfect, wonderful thing for his people. And so, again, circumcision may seem like a silly thing. And frankly, in comparison to some of the stuff we go through in our life, it's a very minor thing. But I have to think that Abraham might have thought, that's odd, but I'm going to do it because you call me to do it. What you tell me to do, I'm going to do. So sometimes these things that don't make sense, that can hurt us badly, these are the things that God uses for his glory and for the good of his people. And especially right here, think about Acts chapter 7 again, and Stephen's death. I can't imagine that at that moment the church wasn't thinking, why am I following Jesus? And then God uses Stephen's death to frighten the church into, or maybe not to frighten, but to cause the church to spread. And that's how the gospel gets to Gentile people. And so, I think in a very real way, we're sitting here right now in these pews because of Stephen's death. And I bet in that moment, no one was thinking, this is a good thing. They were all probably, wow. But God uses those things for his glory and for the good of his people. And what we see here also in these men is that the ones who receive the blessing are the ones that are faithful, the ones that follow, the ones who obey. So there's a couple thoughts. Another thought I had, or another sort of obvious thing here, is that God has a plan, and he's relentlessly fulfilling that plan. And you see that in the life of Moses. He spends the first years of his life in the palace and learning all those things. There's a historian named Philo that talks about all the things that Moses would have learned in the palace, geometry and not just that, all kinds of things, which would be good for leading people. And then because he kills the Egyptian, he's sent out into the wilderness for 40 years to be a shepherd, which was exactly what you would need to lead the people in the wilderness. And so I can't, again, help but think that Moses probably in that second 40 years was thinking, wow, this is a pretty awful thing. But it's the exact same that God was using or doing in Moses' life to prepare him for the 40 years of leading his people into the promised land. So God's got a plan, and he fulfills it. Another thing I would say is clearly there's evil in the world. We see that again in these men's lives, but if you flip over towards the end, there's in verse 43, it talks about Molech and Rephan. Molech is, if you're unaware, is a god that child sacrifice was a big part of worshiping Molech, and it's not coincidental really probably that we're talking about this now. I don't know if you saw just yesterday, I can't remember what state it was, but one of the states passed a referendum to abort babies up to 24 weeks. If you're not aware, a 24-week-old baby has arms and legs and a heart that beats and all those things. I mean, it's a baby, and we live in a country that is willing to cut that baby into pieces. And so, evil didn't just exist then. It exists now. It persists now. But the truth of what Stephen is saying here is God's bigger than all that evil. And then the last thing I would say is Stephen's whole point, that Jesus is everything. And that if you look at those things I just mentioned, the calling, the faith, God's plan, and the evil, Jesus is the answer to all that. Jesus is the one who overcomes the evil. Jesus is our calling. Jesus is the basis for our faith. Jesus has fulfilled God's plan and is the one who brings us through God's plan in our life as well. So everything here is to point to Jesus. Acts chapter 7 is all about Jesus. So we're going to pray, and then we'll maybe talk for a few minutes. God, thank you again for being kind and good to us, and I pray that we would take that from this, God, that you are a good God, that you work in the lives of your people. Sometimes it seems like you're not working, and sometimes God, it even seems like you are taking us to places that we just don't want to go and don't understand. And that's what we see in Abraham and Joseph and Moses and David. But you were good to all these men, and you used all those moments for your glory, and they're good. And so help us to hang on to that truth. But above all, God, help us to, like Stephen did, put Jesus at the center of all of our lives and to hold him above everything. So I love you. I pray these things in Jesus' name.